So I think, like many academics, I'm a journalist turned academic, and in practicing journalism, I fell in love with understanding, what it is that makes journalism look the way that it does. Why is it that journalism covers some stories and not other stories? And why do they cover stories the way that they do? And so I was a sports reporter during the time of the Great Recession, and needed to find new work. And it was during that time I sort of started reevaluating what it was that was important to me, and that drove me to start thinking about how I could answer some of the deeper questions of journalism, things that would help me pass on things to people practicing in the field. Certainly there's a rising visibility of hostility that journalists face in their daily work. I think for me, it was the Unite the Right rally, watching journalists really struggle to work through a really, really difficult reporting situation. And it occurred to me that we needed to better understand some of the things that journalists are facing in trying to cover white nationalism and have a better sense of the solutions for how to best address those. So this became all the more pertinent, I think, with the January 6th riot at the Capitol, where it became clear that we not only had not fixed all of the things that were perhaps problematic in how we do journalism, but in addition, perhaps had additional problems that needed to be addressed. So in discussing and thinking about how digital journalism works, a lot of scholars will differentiate the digital side from the journalism side. And certainly, I think what we know is to be financially successful, we have to lean kind of into the digital side. However, I think that ignores some of the really important legacies that we pull from journalism. We still are in schools of journalism, probably for a reason, right? There's something really essential to that. So some of the problems that journalists face, the first would be audience orientation. Is audience orientation a problem? Depends on who your audience is. And sometimes I think we think our audience is one thing and then discover the audience isn't necessarily who we thought they were. Gaming journalists, of course, face this in the midst of the Gamergate controversy. There's a number of cases where journalists have been geared towards their audience, only to discover that their audience included a hate group or perhaps was motivated by things that didn't motivate the journalists reporting those stories. Definition making, I think that's one aspect that ends up being a problem. So who defines what hate is? And how do we end up communicating that? Unite the Right rally, there were people marching saying, we're the alt-right. Well, what is the alt-right? Alt-right is a term coined by a white nationalist explicitly to mainstream white nationalist ideology. So journalists in covering that would, in some cases, even just sort of ask, what does it mean to you to be alt-right? Which, of course, is doing exactly what Richard Spencer would have hoped with the use of that term. So how we label things, how we define things is certainly problematic, and in digital journalism we have to do that very, very quickly. And lastly, I would point to the problem of churnalism. Churnalism is this idea of very quickly getting information and having to churn it back out and send it out with very little attempt at verification. In digital journalism circles, we sometimes refer to this as the quick hit, where we'll get information, very quickly churn it and send it back out. Not a huge problem in some types of stories, but there's other stories, particularly when we're talking about people groups, we're talking about things that are deeply rooted in, societal politics, that it is actually quite a bit problematic. So journalism, of course, similarly has a very long history of struggling with this. I think what we see is that in digital journalism, the problems have been ramped up quite extensively in terms of the speed that journalism has to operate under. And a lot of the things that have become essential to digital journalism, I mentioned audience orientation, the need to get information out quickly. Those are things that didn't exist in quite the same format prior. In addition, the need to use these digital platforms, what we know about white nationalism is they are devastatingly effective at using digital technology. And so a lot of the technologies that we work so intentionally to bring into our work, these are things that white nationalists are quite capable of leveraging. And so a good example of this is some of the software we use for comment threads. We've gotten rid of some of them, but some of this software that we used for years, white nationalists knew exactly how to make use of that in order to propagate their message. I think one of the things is recognizing where it is that white nationalists are looking to leverage journalism. We know, for example, live shot situations are ones that they are expecting journalists to show up and be live. And so that is where journalists can end up in, frankly, kind of unsafe conditions, where white nationalists will be planning to have the live shot there and planning that they will be able to leverage the journalists shooting live. Also, because it's a live shot, the journalists don't necessarily have the ability to edit out some of the really problematic things that can happen. That's why these rallies are often organized with the expectation and the hope that journalists will show up and conduct a live shot. So I think journalists should think quite intentionally about employing the live shot, particularly when we know that there's a hostile audience and a bad actor audience. I think reevaluating quick hit tactics in digital journalism is quite important. So deciding what are the things that we can quickly churn, what are the things that we cannot. If it's information, for instance, I know we do sort of automated work related to quarterly reports. I don't think that's necessarily a problem. But there's other things that I think require much more intentional thought in terms of how we quickly churn that out for our audience. And I would also say our use of comment threads is quite important. Newsrooms should be quite intentional about what it is that goes into whether they decide to have comments on a story, whether they should have comments in general, what filtering mechanisms they have. We know that just the experience of having witnessed a piece of hate speech or an act of hostility can be really triggering for people who've gone through that before, particularly people from marginalized communities and marginalized backgrounds. And so journalists navigating that, I think, is quite essential. And so some newsrooms have very robust policies where there's filtering mechanisms, easy ways to sort of flag comments. Notably, there's one editor I spoke to this summer who even will call people who've commented on the phone and say, I'd like to read you 5 of the comments that we've flagged over the past week, which causes quite a bit of behavioral change, as you would imagine. That sort of confrontation makes people really evaluate what it is they've been saying. But there are other newsrooms that feel quite strongly that, our audience maybe we shouldn't have comments because maybe this is just opening the door for hostility. If you want to write into our story, write a letter to the editor or send us a message some other way. I think that there's a variety of avenues that make sense for different newsrooms, but I think that newsrooms should be intentional about which avenue they think is best employed for their audience. There's a young woman I spoke to who is a recent graduate of one of our fine U.S. institutions who was sent day of to cover a Billy Roper rally, in charge of Stormfront, neo-Nazi, and arrived at the scene and was confronted by absolute chaos where there's police presence, there's the, how did she put it, the Nazis who look like Nazis, like swastika tattoos. There were the Nazis in suits who she deemed to be the more dangerous. There were counter-protesters. And as she's trying to navigate this scene, her newsroom calls. And they said, you haven't done your Facebook Live hit today. We really need you to go live on Facebook. So as a new journalist, she went live on Facebook. And the crowd ended up sort of maneuvering her up to where Billy Roper was standing, where he just took over her broadcast. And in sharing the story, she expressed a fair amount of shame because it was only really in seeing the comments popping up that she was able to catch all the subtle winks and nods to Holocaust denial. She told me afterwards, she said, Greg, my pawpaw fought these people in World War II, and here they are in my backyard, and I can't even manage effective coverage of these people. To add insult to injury, that night, Billy Roper had a closed-door rally for media and pointed out her publication and said, I really want to thank this publication for finally granting my people a platform. These are the sorts of things that I think, on the one hand, obviously, the coverage she conducted is not coverage that she was proud of. I know she's worked very hard, in the coverage in the days that followed to sort of be more effective. That said, I don't think she was in a fair position to start with. She should never have been in that position to start with. And newsrooms should have more training available for journalists who are going to be in such hostile, sometimes explosive situations. I think we have become accustomed to not having to verify the information we see in the individual stories, but I think certainly this tactics related to journalism seem to be the best way to make money in some cases in journalism. It's really important for us to check the sources of the information that we receive. Perfect example of this was there was a study I did with Newly Paul, University of North Texas. We were looking at a publication known as Christian Today, purports to be a Christian publication, United Kingdom. And they had a piece reporting on Syrian refugees that had a whole host of disinformation in it. And it was troubling to read. Both myself and the co-author were shocked by this information, which was very explicitly, as it turns out, the information they'd gathered had come from kind of a fringe, far-right, white nationalist group, and through the process hadn't really been effectively verified or vetted, and certainly went out to that audience, to Christian Today's audience. These are the sorts of things that can happen, and as audiences, there is something important for us sort of doing that step that sometimes should be done, isn't always done at our news organizations. I would say that your safety is really, really important, and I think a lot of journalism students are bold and courageous in ways that are frankly really, really inspirational. But there's some stories where it is okay to tell your editor, I'd like to have someone come with me. One example of this, I remember I talked to a journalist at one point who knew that there was a KKK group close to where he was working, and very matter-of-factly told me that he had gone by himself in the middle of the night to this barn to meet with this group. He had to be blindfolded, moved to this different location. And in talking to him, I sort of wanted to say, you're lucky to be alive. And I think certainly there's something to be said for the fact that while a lot of journalism is individual, there's also a lot that's done in a team. And so particularly in navigating some of these forms of coverage that are quite tricky, and there's quite a bit of nuance, if we can anticipate hostility, working as a team is important. I think certainly social media is not necessarily part of the solution in terms of hostility. And certainly we've seen that some of the algorithms used for promoting content are things that can be leveraged. I'd mentioned comment threads. There's, of course, the Discuss platform that many newsrooms have used over the years, which is sort of similar to a lot of social media, where if there's a certain type of reaction that people make to a comment, a certain amount of responses, likes to it, it gets moved up. And so that's one where white nationalist groups would just employ bots to basically upvote. They would call them sock puppets to upvote a particular, they would describe them as white pills. These white pills, which would be just the most egregious racist comments. And again, these are things that when people see them are really, really troubling. And so that's in part why it's so important that we assess that. We know that some of the social media platforms, Facebook's a good example, where they do have some AI in place to automatically detect and combat hate speech when it pops up. As we also know, Facebook's algorithm is not perfect and has its own problems. And so us in the news industry sort of thinking about how best to make use of that and think about that, I think, is important. Hostility is never an easy thing for a journalist to confront. However, I would say that one of the opportunities when journalists are navigating this form of coverage is that we have the opportunity to enact justice in our world. There's one story I remember of a journalist who arrived at the scene of a hate group rally and saw a father there with his kid on his shoulders, and was taken. Why would you bring your kid to something like this? Went and interviewed this father, had decided very intentionally, I'm not going to talk to any of the protesters, I just want to talk to the community. Very classic storyteller role of journalists. And so he went to talk to this father, and the father said, my son needs to know what evil looks like. If he doesn't see this, if I didn't bring him to see this, he wouldn't understand what it looks like. And I think there's stories like that are quite powerful, right? These are stories that can help us understand our communities better, help us understand the people around us better. And so while the rally itself occurring is, of course, not great news, the fact that it presents the opportunity to think more deeply about the us in a community, I think, is really important.